All right, guys, good afternoon, good morning. Hope this finds you all well. We're going to be talking about a fairly simple, broad based topic, but one that I think is really interesting, if not at least just from a big picture perspective, and that is this mass period of immigration and the urbanization of America that takes place during the Gilded Age, and it changes quite literally the demographic face of America. Um, both in terms of race and religion, but also in terms of population density and uh, kind of the character of America, as it were. So we know that there's these incredible technological advances that took place that we talked about last time, and this leads to this urbanization of America, people moving into cities, especially this incredible influx of immigrants that we're going to talk about, for whom cities are the cheapest and most convenient place to live, especially for unskilled pools of labor. The same holds true not just for immigration, but for migration, as a lot of rural America is going to move into cities because the technological advances had dictated a lesser reliance on labor for the agricultural business. Um, of course, with this rapid influx into the American city, becomes urban problems, and we had hinted at this before, right? Even prior to the Gilded Age. Remember the quote unquote intellectual defense of slavery promoted by some in the South, said that the life in the South for a slave was better than it was for the white wage slave in these dirty infested cities up north. Um, and it is true that for a good period of time, those problems only got worse. There's sewage and trash in the streets. There's disease, and but what we see here again during the Gilded Age is quite literally the growing up of America. And so, what we mean by that in this instance is that America is addressing these urban problems. Cities like New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and Boston are creating sanitation departments and chlorinating water. Crime, which was a problem, and fires, which are a problem, become lessened simply through the creation of police forces and full time fire departments. And this gives us a glimpse at kind of the cities as we know them today, which include series of infrastructural developments, subways and streetcars, a lot of which also helps to eliminate some of that animal waste in the streets. It's not just horse and buggies anymore. And so we see really kind of the growth of the American city from an infrastructure standpoint. Not all of it is, peaches and roses, though. For the immigrants coming in waves, as we will talk about shortly, um, there's a huge housing problem. And so a lot of cities construct what we call tenements, which are massive buildings that are designed to suit the needs of these unskilled labor pools, and especially this new class of immigrants coming into especially the East Coast cities. But they crowd the families into single rooms. There's little to no plumbing or ventilation. And it's kind of a fascinating way of living, if not envious, right? To kind of examine how these groups would have lived and these families would have lived. And this is throughout the entire time period. We're talking post Civil War, reconstructive area, all the way up until and through the early turn of the century in the 1900s and the 1910s. Um, there is a tenement museum that I would steer your attention to, and I would ask you to pause for a moment and play the video that's linked on this slide. And it might give you an idea of what living in these tenements would look like. for this new class of immigrants. So I would ask you to pause me and play this for a couple minutes right now. You can also check out the Tenement Museum website. There are some virtual experiences. I've noticed since they've closed because of the pandemic, they have uh, upped the game on virtual experiences, but have also started to charge for some of those. But I would ask that you go check it out and explore this website a little bit. This is a fascinating topic to me, clearly. Now, with these changes in the country, um, we're going to explore a little bit about some of the societal questions and principles that will be on display and be up for challenge. So let's start with this notion of social Darwinism, right? Referring to survival of the fittest. There is still this belief, in large part in America, or at least kind of this ethos of social Darwinism, harkening back to this idea of the Protestant work ethic that we have in America. That individuals earn their success through hard work and intelligence, and therefore the inverse must also be true. That those who are not successful must be lazy, must not be intelligent, must not be deserving of success. And while it's very true that some of the characters that will rise during the Gilded Age will be names forever associated with uh, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and hard work and success, we're also going to have to question whether or not that system is always set up for success for the vast majority of the people. Some of the incredibly uber successful robber barons, as Howard Zinn would call them, of this day and age, are incredibly notable for, yes, their hard work and yes, their success. But there's also going to be the rotten core of that apple, right? The low wages, the low competition factors associated with the creation of these American monopolies long before there's any sense of a progressive era or other reforms that we're going to talk about later. Um, Nevertheless, we talked about at the beginning of class with Rockefeller, and we see that he establishes a whole host of charitable foundations. We see Andrew Carnegie pictured here, who believes in the gospel of wealth. To those that much is given, much is expected. But this is going to be an interesting kind of seesaw to keep our eyes on as we progress through American history and the economic cycles and disputes between the capital holders and pools of labor, which is largely what we're talking about when we get into the this new class of immigrants, many of whom are incredibly exploited. There are some early reform movements long before we get to this progressive era, and we talked in class before our notes here today about Jane Addams of the Hull House. So there is a movement recognizing early on this idea of the social gospel, right? The importance of serving the poor. It's a part of service to God. Jane Addams and others establish settlement houses in cities like Chicago and New York. Churches begin to help with some of the urban problems. But this is long before there's really any sense of kind of government intervention in the progressive era. Who needs the serving? Okay, well, the by and large, the vast majority of the labor class, the unskilled labor class in particular, is immigrants, and in large part a new class of immigrants. Immigration is not just rapid, but it looks different than it ever has before. Um, Most immigrants are allowed easy entry into the United States. They've got to pass a physical exam. They've got to meet some very low bar legal and financial requirements, and that's it. And so remember, to come here legally at one point was much easier than it is now, and that especially holds true during the Gilded Age. On the East Coast, the main port of entry, of course, is Ellis Island in New York, kind of New Jersey too, if we're being honest, right? And on the West Coast, Angel Island out in San Francisco, where perhaps as a factor of race, entry is a little bit more difficult than it is at Ellis Island. We see some incredible growth of the cities during the Gilded Age, in large part because of immigration. You can take a look at some of those factors here. New York almost triples in population from 1860, 40 years later, to 1900. Philadelphia almost quadruples in population. In addition to San Francisco on the West Coast, some of those other cities, Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, are some of the major recipients of this new class of immigrants. So, what do we mean by this new class of immigrants? Well, up until about 1880, most immigrants to the United States are what we might call WASPs, if you've ever heard that term: white, Anglo Saxon, Protestant, very often from Great Britain or other Western European countries. They're fairly well educated. They're kind of used to American like traditions in representative government. The only real deviation to that is perhaps the Catholics coming in from Ireland. And they receive their fair amount of discrimination for that. But after 1880, during the 1880s, during the 1890s, this class of immigrants changes in that very often they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. They're coming from Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, not necessarily Protestant, but Orthodox or Catholic. These countries, these cultures have little history of democratic government. They're used to an authoritarian government. So they come with a different set of experiences and bring kind of a different set of experiences, but a different culture to these cities that we've come to kind of think of as melting pots. The great American melting pot that is America, that is New York City. Um, but I would maybe kind of challenge that notion, right? For instance, when we take a look at Irish immigrants in New York City, by the way, by 1890, there's twice as many Irish in New York City as there are in Dublin, the capital of Ireland. We see on large scale, Irish neighborhoods, just like we see Italian neighborhoods and Polish neighborhoods. We see these immigrants coming from different cultures. And the you know the the pattern in American culture is to talk about this American culture, this melting pot. But what we really see is kind of maybe more of a mix, like a salad bowl, that there are these cultures living together geographically, but kind of forming their own, pockets, their own communities within that culture. Very much from 1880 on all the way up through kind of the 1950s, 1960s. You could very much expect in a large American city to understand that you were in, an Italian neighborhood or an Irish neighborhood or a Polish neighborhood. More of a salad bowl than a melting pot. Certainly, we've got, Chinatowns in cities and little Italies and that sort of thing. Um, but on the East Coast, we understand that while the numbers jumped 20 million immigrants from 1870 all the way up to 1920, they're coming from all over Europe. They're bringing new cultures, languages, religions, and they're all here really for economic opportunity. They're seeking a better life through job opportunities, perhaps a little bit further west than the East Coast, the Germans. looking for cheap land for farming. Many of them, yes, looking for religious or, for that matter, political freedoms. And this is kind of the period where America becomes this quote unquote melting pot or salad bowl, if you prefer, especially in these rapidly growing cities on the East Coast. On the West Coast, we see certainly a little bit more racial diversity. Most of the immigration coming from the West Coast is not Anglo, as it were. Okay, they're across the Pacific, and so coming in through Angel Island are a lot of immigrants from Asia, Japan, but especially China. Um, there's incredibly poor conditions in China at this point. The same is happening in Mexico and portions of Central America. So, again, we see a little bit more racial diversity in the West. Japanese first come to Hawaii seeking jobs and later continue that journey to the American West Coast. Um, a lot of Americans kind of resist this. Um, and Japan helps to uh, come into an agreement with the United States in what's known as the Gentleman's Agreement between the United States and Japan that forced Japan or asked Japan, and Japan acquiesced to limit emigration to the United States from Japan. That is not the case in Mexico, where there's political turmoil and other factors that forced a lot of Mexicans to immigrate to the United States, coupled with the fact that the United States is really trying to promote westward migration. We're still right kind of in that period here of manifest destiny. And as we'll talk about when we talk about westward expansion in a little bit further detail later on, there are government provided incentive programs like the Homestead Act, which encourages settlement out west. And a lot of that is witnessed through migration of Latin American populations from South America and Mexicans. But the story of Chinese migration is perhaps the most well known. Now, the Chinese did not just come to America, they went all over the world: Australia, Hawaii, South America, South Africa. But in the United States, there's an incredible period of immigration that takes place, especially after 1848. And if you can think of why that is, well, I hope you can think of why that is, right? That has to do in large part with the gold rush. The gold rush, gold discovered in 1848, meaning that the 49ers, right? 1849. The 49ers represent not just Chinese, but also a whole host of Americans moving from the East in search of, well, what's the number one reason that people, number one answer to every question ever? Money, right? The number one reason for most human migration is to improve people's economic well-being. Um, a lot of Chinese find work on the railroad and find continued employment on the railroad. So even after kind of the gold rush subsides, Chinese migration continues as America is completing the transcontinental railroad. And we talked about that with the wetting of the rails. We talked about all of how incredibly important the completion of the railway system is to connecting the nation. But those rails need to be laid, and Chinese makes up probably from a demographic standpoint the single largest pool of labor to complete the railroad. You may see some of that depicted in that series Hell on Wheels that I talked about and showed you a clip of in our last class. This is also where we get when we talk, hey, are we a melting pot or a salad bowl? Chinatowns set up in major cities. And obviously, if you're an East Coast kind of guy, you may think about Chinatown in New York City, but most major cities have incredible Chinatowns, and especially out west, cities like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And so this is a little bit on the story of Chinese immigration. The story of Chinese labor on the transcontinental railroad is not necessarily a glorious one. Okay, the wages are incredibly low. The working conditions are incredibly dangerous. Um, but this is still probably a better life than they had been afforded during the turmoil that's taking place in China at the time. Um, and the American railway system would not have been completed without this incredible influx and hard work from the Chinese labor pool. For a long time, America welcomed the Chinese because of the need for their labor and for their hard work. They were viewed as being, not just hard workers, but clean, industrious people. But because of that work ethic, they were increasingly successful and um, entered this period of eventually pretty severe discrimination against Chinese in America. Laws being put in place limiting the number of Chinese immigrants. Uh, the whites are in America are routinely discriminating against the Chinese. Um, and eventually, that backlash becomes secured through legislation. The Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 that bans all further Chinese immigration into America for 10 years. It's then renewed after 10 years in 1892, and 10 years later, made quote unquote permanent in 1902. There being some exceptions, students, business leaders, educated persons. Obviously, it doesn't exist today, but the backlash is real. And oftentimes we kind of see that pattern in American history of like, you know, the immigrant classes kind of turning on the most recent immigrant class. Understanding, of course, groups like the Irish had previously been uh, discriminated against and will continue to be discriminated against with, NINA, no Irish need apply. But certainly there's a legislative backlash against Chinese immigration here in the 1880s and 1890s. Um, all classes of new immigrants, Chinese, Irish, Polish, etc. They all need to find housing. They need to find work. Many of them don't know English. They're unfamiliar with the culture. So they form those ethnic communities that I talked about before. The Chinatowns, the Polish neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods. In cities like Hoboken, New Jersey, New York City, Chicago, of course, out west. The latest group of immigrants is always subject, it seems, to the lowest pay and the most difficult working conditions. And they're left to kind of fend by themselves, okay? Especially as there is this spirit of nativism that's rising on both coasts, that either the natives, we got to be careful about that term, right? Because it's not Native Americans as in what we erroneously call American Indians, but the WASP population that had been born in America, had been in America for several generations, or perhaps of those demographic subsets like the British that came here with an easier path, having been, better educated and speaking English and used to kind of some of the cultural norms that would exist because of the similarities between British and America. These groups turn on, as I said, the new groups, right? And so there's a rise of nativism or favoritism towards those born in America, or at least perhaps those that can be, kind of pass as being born in America. And in American culture, and for that matter, as we see with the Chinese Exclusion Act, in American politics, there's a lot of anti immigrant groups that are formed from this movement. We had spoken previously about one such early group with the Know Nothing Party. Um, but the natives, they're not protesting the white immigrants from Britain or Germany or Scandinavia. They're not protesting the Protestants, but they are protesting the Japanese and the Chinese and the Mexicans and South Americans, um, perhaps the Russians, the Italians, perhaps the Catholic Irish. Okay. And this is a very real kind of social backlash that takes place. And also results in what's called the Americanization movement that takes place on both coasts and is designed to assimilate all of these people into becoming this primary American culture, this melting pot. It's administered through schools and churches, other civic organizations to teach English, history, government, social etiquette. Many of the immigrants quickly embrace it. Others resist, and they continue to find their support in their ethnic communities. But what we're going to see is generally this kind of social cultural tug of war over this assimilation, right? And whether this notion of America as a melting pot or a salad bowl, and probably each has benefits and each has drawbacks. Some are more than happy to and proud of becoming American, and some want to do that and also kind of hold on to some of the traditions of the homeland or of their family. And it's quite frankly a tug of war that is still with us today when we talk about what does it mean? What does it mean to be American? Um, Again, with just taking notes. The only work I'm asking you to do is to explore some of the other resources that I've made available to you. The Men Who Built America is available on Amazon Prime. I would suggest it's probably a little bit favorable to those robber barons, but it's really well done. It's fascinating. It gets into a lot of topics, including not just the business tycoons, but industry and railroads. You'll probably, pick up a lot on the labor disputes that are taking place, and especially as this period of immigration continues. So, can't recommend it enough. Check that out. I've linked for you as well. Howard Zinn, chapter 11, Robber Barons and Rebels. He does a really good job in this chapter in particular. I think one of my favorites. And all of our notes here are corresponding with American Pageant chapter number 24. So check that out. And that is all I got for you today. Thanks, guys. Take care.